Here is a very good question that has been asked. JavaScript document says in JavaScript, a primitive value or primitive data type is data that is not an object and has no methods. The question is, whereas strings have or has methods, please clarify. So what happens is in JavaScript, you know that there are primitive data types. Under primitives, we have strings, numbers, Boolean, undefined, null. Right? So these are all the primitive data types that are there in JavaScript. So when you talk about primitives, primitives are the ones which does not have property or methods. It's the objects that have properties and methods. But what happens here is strings is an exception. Now, why is it an exception? Because whenever you're working with real world applications, there's a lot of interaction that happens with the user where you're reading information from the user, you're performing some kind of a computation. All of them is going to be based on strings. For example, let us say you have a user registration form. You're taking a user's password and you want to check what is the password or how many characters are there in the password. Now, let us say you have some logic which says a password should contain more than 8 characters. Now, we need to have some kind of a mechanism to determine how many characters have been typed in by the user. In the same way, let us say we want to convert all the characters which the user has entered, which is in small case. Everything has to be displayed in the uppercase. So there are these use cases that are available. So what happens is, yes, strings at the end of the day are primitives, but during runtime, they get converted to something called as the string object. Now they make this as a string object, or they're converting it as a string object because now as it's an object, a lot of properties and methods are now made readily available for us. And during the runtime, when it's made into a string object, we can now go on to invoke its properties and its methods or its methods, right? So for example, if we have, let's say, a variable called as a username, and he types in DCT Academy. Now, let us say you want to figure out at this point of time, I have a string and then let's store into a variable. So what happens is internally this string gets converted to a string object. And now as it's an object, you now have access to the properties and the methods that are provided. Like for example, you want to know how many characters are there in this particular string. You know that there's a length property provided on this particular variable. You could do something like console.log username dot length. Now, how is this enabled? Because during the runtime, they'll convert it to a string object. And as it's a string object, we can now make use of properties or methods. So when I run this file, it should tell me that, okay, there are 10 characters in it. Now, what if I want to display all of this in uppercase? So we could do something like username dot to uppercase. So by itself, it is not there. But while the code gets executed, they convert that to a string object, and then that happens. So is there a way where we can see a reference to the string object? There surely is. When we use a method like, let's say I use the method called as slice, right? You know, you want to extract a part of the string. You can check this out. It says the index to the beginning of the specified portion of the string obj. So here is an example where they're referring it as the string object. Why? Because we're calling a method on the string. So yes, that's how this particular thing works.